War is, by its very nature, a story of extremes. Of heroes and villains, victory and defeat, suffering and survival. But sometimes, within the vast darkness of global conflict, we find stories that challenge our assumptions and force us to reconsider what we thought we knew. This is one of those stories. During World War II, the treatment of prisoners of war varied dramatically depending on where they were held and by whom. The horrors experienced by Allied prisoners in Japanese camps are well documented: starvation, torture, forced labor, and death rates that shocked the world. Conversely, Japanese propaganda portrayed American captivity as brutal and inhumane, warning their citizens that capture meant certain torture and death. But what actually happened when Japanese civilians and soldiers, including women, found themselves in American custody? The answer might surprise you. Some female Japanese prisoners of war held in American camps described their experience using words that seem almost impossible given the context. Paradise on earth. How could imprisonment during wartime possibly be described this way? What does this tell us about the conditions these women came from, the treatment they received, and the complex realities of war that don't fit neatly into our narratives of good versus evil? Today, we explore this little-known chapter of World War II history. We'll examine the experiences of Japanese women held in American custody, the stark contrasts between different POW systems, and what these stories reveal about humanity in the midst of humanity's darkest hours. This is not a story of justifying war or glorifying imprisonment. It's a story about unexpected compassion, cultural shock, and the complex truths that emerge when we look closely at history. To understand this story, we must first understand the broader context of prisoner treatment during World War II in the Pacific Theater. The Pacific War was marked by extraordinary brutality on all sides. The fighting was savage, island by island, with both sides viewing the other as fundamentally alien and often subhuman. Japanese military culture, influenced by the Bushido Code, considered surrender to be the ultimate dishonor, worse than death itself. Soldiers were expected to fight to the last man, and those who surrendered were seen as having forfeited their humanity. This belief had catastrophic consequences for Allied prisoners. The Japanese military reasoned that since their own soldiers would rather die than surrender, those who did surrender had demonstrated weakness and cowardice unworthy of respect. The result was systematic mistreatment of Allied POWs that shocked even hardened military observers. In Japanese prison camps throughout Asia and the Pacific, Allied prisoners faced starvation rations, forced labor in brutal conditions, routine beatings, medical experimentation, and summary executions. The death rate among Allied prisoners in Japanese custody was approximately 27%, compared to just 4% of Allied prisoners held by Germany and Italy. These numbers tell a story of systematic neglect and abuse. The Bataan Death March in the Philippines, where thousands of American and Filipino prisoners died during a forced march, became a symbol of Japanese brutality. Camp conditions throughout the Japanese prison system were characterized by insufficient food, no medical care, and guards who viewed prisoners with contempt. Meanwhile, Japanese propaganda prepared their citizens and soldiers for the worst if they fell into American hands. They were told Americans would torture them, rape the women, mutilate prisoners, and commit unspeakable atrocities. These warnings were so effective that many Japanese soldiers and civilians chose suicide over surrender. During the Battle of Saipan in 1944, hundreds of Japanese civilians jumped from cliffs to their deaths rather than face capture by American forces. Against this backdrop of mutual fear and hatred, the question of how America would treat Japanese prisoners became critical. Would the Americans follow the Geneva Convention protocols? Would they seek revenge for Pearl Harbor and the mistreatment of their own prisoners? Or would something unexpected happen? The answer would surprise both sides. Before we discuss their experiences in American custody, we need to understand who these women were and how they came to be prisoners of war. Unlike the millions of male combatants, female Japanese POWs were relatively rare. The majority were civilians who found themselves in war zones as the conflict spread across the Pacific. Some were nurses attached to military units, caring for wounded soldiers. Others were settlers in Japanese-occupied territories, families of soldiers and administrators who had moved to places like Saipan, Tinian, and other Pacific islands as part of Japan's colonial expansion. Many came from poor backgrounds in Japan and had seen the Pacific territories as opportunities for a better life. The Japanese government had encouraged migration to these islands, promising land and prosperity. These women had left behind everything they knew, seeking to build new lives in what they were told would be the expanding Japanese empire. When American forces began retaking these islands in 1944 and 1945, these civilians found themselves trapped in combat zones. The propaganda they had been exposed to filled them with terror. They had been told that American soldiers were barbaric monsters who would rape and kill them. Many chose to hide in caves or jungles, facing starvation and disease rather than surrender. Some were captured during the final phases of island battles. Others, starving and sick, eventually emerged from hiding when they could no longer survive on their own. Some were found weeks or even months after fighting had ended, barely alive, having witnessed the deaths of family members and neighbors. There were also a small number of female military personnel, primarily nurses who had been serving in field hospitals or naval facilities. These women had received military training and were considered non-combatants under international law, but they had been serving in an official military capacity. The women who became POWs ranged in age from teenagers to elderly. Some were mothers with young children. Some were young women who had barely begun their adult lives. Others were older women who had lived through decades of Japanese militarism and propaganda. They came from different social classes, though most were from working class or farming backgrounds. What united them was their absolute terror of what awaited them in American custody. They had been taught that death was preferable to capture. Some had witnessed the mass suicides on Saipan and other islands, where entire families leaped to their deaths rather than face the Americans. Those who survived to become POWs often did so only because they were too weak to resist or because they had children they wanted to protect. They entered American custody expecting the worst possible treatment imaginable. What they found instead would fundamentally challenge everything they believed about their enemy, and, in many cases, about their own society. Imagine the scene: women who have spent weeks or months hiding in caves and jungles, surviving on minimal food, many sick or injured, all convinced they are walking toward torture and death. They have been captured by the enemy they've been taught to fear more than anything. They are brought to American prisoner of war camps. And then, something unexpected happens. The first shock for many Japanese women prisoners was simply being treated humanely. Instead of beatings and torture, they received medical attention. Army doctors and medics examined them, treated their wounds and illnesses, and provided medicine. For many, this was the first proper medical care they had ever received in their lives. Those who were malnourished, which was the majority, were given food. Not starvation rations, but actual meals with sufficient calories. The contrast with what they had been told to expect was so stark that many initially refused to eat, believing the food must be poisoned. It took time and demonstration by American personnel eating the same food to convince them it was safe. American policy toward Japanese POWs was based on strict adherence to the Geneva Convention, despite the fact that Japan had not formally ratified these agreements and did not follow them in treating Allied prisoners. The United States made a strategic and moral decision to treat enemy prisoners according to international humanitarian law regardless of how their own soldiers were being treated. This wasn't just about moral superiority. American military leaders understood that proper treatment of prisoners could provide intelligence benefits, improve America's international reputation, and potentially encourage more enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. There were pragmatic as well as ethical reasons for the policy. But the implementation of this policy, particularly regarding female prisoners, went beyond mere adherence to rules. Camp commanders and personnel often showed genuine compassion and understanding toward the traumatized women in their custody. One account describes a group of women who were found hiding in a cave on Saipan, starving and terrified. When American soldiers discovered them, instead of forcing them out, they left food and water at the cave entrance and withdrew. They returned daily, leaving supplies and speaking gently, until finally the women felt safe enough to emerge on their own. This patience and empathy was far from what the women had been taught to expect. Upon arrival at organized camps, the women were provided with clean clothing, shelter, and sanitary facilities. For many, this meant access to things they had never had before, even in Japan. Running water, soap, towels, and private areas for personal hygiene were luxuries unknown to many rural Japanese women of that era. The camps themselves, while certainly not luxurious, were adequate and in many cases comfortable by the standards of the time. Barracks were clean and dry. There were communal areas for socializing. Children were given toys and books. Medical facilities were available with trained staff. Perhaps most significantly, the women were treated with respect. Guards were instructed to be courteous. Physical punishment was strictly forbidden. The women were addressed politely, and their dignity was maintained as much as possible within the constraints of imprisonment. This humane treatment had a profound psychological effect. Women who had been prepared to die rather than face capture found themselves in a situation that contradicted everything they had been told. The cognitive dissonance was enormous. They had to reconcile their propaganda-shaped beliefs with the reality they were experiencing. As days turned into weeks and months, the women began to adapt to life in American custody. What emerged was a daily routine that, remarkably, many would later describe in positive terms. Food was one of the most significant factors in this assessment. The women received 3 meals a day with adequate caloric content. While the food was different from traditional Japanese cuisine, it was nutritious and plentiful. Rice was provided when available, along with vegetables, occasional meat or fish, bread, and even treats like canned fruit. For women who had grown up in rural poverty in Japan, where food scarcity was common, and who had then endured near starvation while hiding from American forces, this regular food supply was nothing short of miraculous. Some women later recalled that it was the first time in their lives they had gone to bed without hunger. Children in the camps were given milk, which was rare in Japan at that time. They received toys, including items donated by American military personnel and Red Cross organizations. Schools were established in larger camps, where children could continue their education. American soldiers sometimes played with the children, teaching them games and simple English words. Medical care continued beyond initial treatment. Pregnant women received prenatal care and safe deliveries, something many had never experienced before. Sick children were treated promptly. Chronic conditions that had gone untreated for years were finally addressed. Dental care was provided. Vaccinations were administered. The women were given opportunities for productive activity. They could do laundry, mending, and craft work. Some camps established gardens where prisoners could grow vegetables, providing both activity and supplemental food. Women taught each other traditional crafts, organized cultural activities, and created social structures within the camps. Religious practices were respected. Though Shinto and Buddhist practices were unfamiliar to most American personnel, prisoners were generally allowed to maintain their spiritual traditions as long as they didn't conflict with camp security. This religious freedom was significant, as it showed respect for Japanese culture even in the midst of war. Social structures emerged organically. Older women became informal leaders, settling disputes and organizing activities. Mothers formed supportive networks to help each other care for children. young women found companionship and mutual support. These social bonds helped prisoners cope with the trauma of their experiences and the uncertainty of their future. Letters from home were delivered when possible, though this was complicated by the ongoing war and the disruption of Japanese civil society. The International Red Cross facilitated some communication, allowing women to inform family members they were alive and reasonably well. Entertainment was not forbidden. Women sang traditional songs, told stories, and organized cultural performances. Some camps provided access to books and materials for traditional Japanese arts like calligraphy and origami. American personnel sometimes arranged film screenings or musical performances. Perhaps most remarkably, American soldiers often showed personal kindness that went beyond official policy. Stories emerged of soldiers sharing their own rations with hungry children, giving up blankets to cold prisoners, or simply showing friendliness and humor that helped ease the fear and anxiety of captivity. One particularly poignant account describes an American soldier who noticed a young Japanese woman crying and, through gestures and broken communication, learned she was worried about her mother back in Japan. The soldier, who had a Japanese-American translator friend, arranged for the woman to send a message through Red Cross channels. This small act of compassion had enormous impact on the woman's. The contrast with conditions back in wartime Japan was striking. By 1944 and 1945, Japan itself was experiencing severe shortages. For women who had never experienced being addressed directly and respectfully by authority figures, this was revolutionary. American personnel, operating under Geneva Convention protocols and military professionalism, treated the women as human beings entitled to certain basic rights and dignities. This was a completely new experience for many. The sense of community that developed among the women prisoners also contributed to positive feelings about the camps. Removed from the strict social hierarchies of Japanese society, women formed friendships across class lines. They supported each other emotionally, shared childcare duties, and created a sense of solidarity. This female community was empowering in ways that would have been impossible in traditional Japanese society. It's crucial to note that not every woman felt this way, and not every camp provided the same experience. Some prisoners remained deeply traumatized by their experiences, angry about their captivity, worried about family members back in Japan, or unable to overcome their indoctrination about Americans. The paradise description came from some women, not all, and always with the understanding that they were comparing it to their previous lives, not to an absolute standard of freedom. There's also a psychological phenomenon to consider: Stockholm Syndrome and adaptive coping mechanisms. Some women may have developed positive feelings toward their captors as a way of psychologically surviving captivity. The human mind seeks to find meaning and positivity even in difficult circumstances, and viewing captivity in a positive light could be a survival mechanism. However, the consistency of positive reports, the specific details about material conditions, and the fact that these assessments often came years after liberation when women had no reason to praise their former captors, suggests that the positive descriptions reflected genuine experiences rather than just psychological adaptation. To fully appreciate the significance of these women's experiences, we must confront the stark contrast with how Allied prisoners were treated in Japanese custody. This comparison is not meant to create a simplistic good versus evil narrative, but to understand the very different philosophies and practices that governed prisoner treatment. Allied prisoners in Japanese camps faced conditions that were catastrophic. Starvation was systematic. Daily rations often consisted of a small amount of rice, perhaps some vegetable scraps, and little else. Prisoners became skeletal, many dying of malnutrition or malnutrition-related diseases like beriberi. Camps that held thousands of prisoners could see dozens dying every day from starvation alone. Medical care was essentially non-existent. Prisoners suffered from dysentery, malaria, cholera, and other diseases without treatment. wounds became infected and gangrenous. Simple illnesses that could have been treated with basic medicines became death sentences. Japanese military medical personnel often refused to treat prisoners, viewing them as unworthy of scarce resources. Forced labor was routine and brutal. Prisoners were worked to exhaustion and beyond, building railways, working in mines, or doing other hard labor under guard. The infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, known as the Death Railway, killed an estimated 13,000 Allied prisoners and 100,000 Asian laborers through overwork, starvation, and disease. Physical abuse was systematic and routine. Guards beat prisoners for minor infractions or no reason at all. Torture was common, including waterboarding, beatings, and other forms of physical torment. Prisoners were forced to stand at attention for hours in the sun, beaten if they collapsed. The psychological treatment was equally destructive. Prisoners were humiliated, forced to bow to guards, and subjected to arbitrary and cruel punishments designed to break their spirit. Any show of defiance could result in severe beating or execution. The death rate tells the story. 27% of Allied prisoners in Japanese custody died, compared to 4% in German and Italian custody. In some camps and on some work projects, the death rate exceeded 50%. These were not unfortunate accidents but the predictable result of systematic neglect and abuse. Why was there such a difference between American treatment of Japanese prisoners and Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners? Several factors contributed. First, different military cultures and values. The American military operated under laws and regulations that required humane treatment of prisoners. Violations could result in court-martial. The Japanese military operated under a code that viewed surrender as dishonorable and prisoners as unworthy of consideration. Second, different economic situations. The United States, with its vast resources and industrial capacity, could afford to feed and care for prisoners without significantly impacting the war effort. Japan, struggling with resource shortages and supply line disruptions, prioritized scarce resources for combat operations over prisoner welfare. Third, different strategic calculations. American leaders believed humane treatment of prisoners could provide intelligence benefits, encourage enemy surrender, and bolster America's moral standing internationally. Japanese leaders, operating under assumptions of racial superiority and total commitment to victory, saw no strategic value in prisoner welfare. Fourth, different international positions. The United States was eager to maintain its reputation as a civilized nation fighting a just war. Japan had withdrawn from the League of Nations and operated with less concern for international opinion. Fifth, and perhaps most fundamentally, different views of human dignity. American policy, influenced by Enlightenment values and Christian ethics, held that all humans possessed inherent dignity that had to be respected even in war. Japanese military ideology, influenced by an extreme interpretation of Bushido and emperor worship, held that those who surrendered had forfeited their claim to human dignity. The result of these differences was visible in the physical condition of prisoners. Allied prisoners liberated from Japanese camps were often barely recognizable as human beings, skeletal and traumatized. Japanese prisoners released from American custody were generally healthy and had often gained weight during captivity. Photographs from the end of the war show this contrast starkly. Images of emaciated Allied prisoners being liberated from Japanese camps shocked the world and influenced the Tokyo war crimes trials. Meanwhile, Japanese prisoners being repatriated from American custody looked well-fed and healthy. The story of these female Japanese POWs didn't end with the war. Their experiences and the accounts they provided have had lasting historical significance and raise important questions about memory, narrative, and the complexity of war. When these women returned to Japan after the war, many faced difficult reintegration. Japanese society was devastated, struggling to rebuild from the ruins of defeat. Food shortages were severe, infrastructure was destroyed, and millions were homeless. The women who had been prisoners returned to a country in chaos. Some faced suspicion or stigma for having survived captivity. In a culture that had glorified death over surrender, those who had been prisoners sometimes encountered questions about why they hadn't chosen suicide. The cultural shame associated with capture could follow them for years. Yet many of these women spoke openly about their experiences in American custody, often in terms that shocked their listeners. Their accounts of adequate food, medical care, and humane treatment seemed almost unbelievable to Japanese who had endured the horrors of the war years and its aftermath. These testimonies served several purposes in post-war Japan. First, they helped to break down the propaganda image of Americans as monsters. As Japan began its transformation into an American ally during the occupation period, these positive stories of American treatment helped ease the transition. Second, they provided evidence for war crimes tribunals and historical records. The contrast between American and Japanese treatment of prisoners became part of the official record of the war and influenced international humanitarian law going forward. Third, they raised uncomfortable questions within Japan about its own society and treatment of women. If women who had been prisoners of war described that experience as superior to their previous lives in Japan, what did that say about Japanese society? This prompted some reflection and contributed to post-war social reforms. American authorities used these testimonies carefully. On one hand, they demonstrated that America had fought a humane war even against a brutal enemy. On the other hand, there was sensitivity about being seen as exploiting these stories for propaganda purposes or as trivializing the genuine suffering of imprisonment. The International Red Cross and other organizations studied the American POW system as a model for humanitarian treatment during conflict. The generally successful adherence to Geneva Convention standards by American forces, though not perfect, with some documented violations, became a case study in international law. However, the paradise framing has sometimes been misused or misunderstood. Some have used it to suggest that imprisonment can be acceptable, or even beneficial, which misses the point entirely. Others have used it to create simplistic narratives about American moral superiority while ignoring American war crimes and atrocities that did occur, particularly the atomic bombings and the internment of Japanese Americans. The real lesson of these women's stories is more nuanced. It shows that even in war, choices exist. The decision to treat prisoners humanely or cruelly is a choice. The United States chose to follow international humanitarian law regarding Japanese prisoners even while its own prisoners were being brutally mistreated. This choice reflected both moral commitment and strategic calculation. It also highlights the importance of baseline conditions in shaping perception. The women's positive assessment of captivity reflected their previous experiences of poverty, powerlessness, and hardship. Their testimony reminds us that war's victims come from real lives, often lives of pre-existing suffering, and that context matters enormously in understanding human experience. The experiences of these women also demonstrate the power of small kindnesses in extreme circumstances. The American soldiers who shared candy with children, the medics who treated sick prisoners with care, the administrators who maintained dignity and respect, these individuals made choices that had profound impacts on the people in their charge. Finally, these stories complicate our narratives of World War II. We tend to see the Pacific War in stark terms: good versus evil, civilization versus barbarism. The reality was more complex. While Japanese militarism was certainly brutal and America's cause was just, individual experiences within that framework varied enormously. Some Americans committed atrocities. Some Japanese showed compassion. And sometimes the victims of one side's aggression found unexpected humanity from their captors. What can we learn from these nearly forgotten stories of female Japanese POWs in American custody? As we look at a world still marked by conflict, imprisonment, and humanitarian crises, these historical experiences offer important insights. First, the importance of maintaining humanitarian standards even when enemies don't reciprocate. The United States treated Japanese prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards despite horrific treatment of American prisoners by Japan. This wasn't naive or weak, it was both morally right and strategically wise. It maintained American moral standing, provided intelligence benefits, and potentially saved lives by encouraging surrender. Today, in conflicts around the world, this lesson remains relevant. The temptation to abandon humanitarian standards in response to enemy brutality is strong, but doing so ultimately serves no one's interests and perpetuates cycles of cruelty. Second, the power of meeting basic human needs. For these women, regular food, medical care, and physical safety represented not luxury but fundamental human requirements that they had been denied. Their positive response to receiving these basics reminds us that ensuring human dignity doesn't require extravagance, just meeting people's fundamental needs with respect. This has implications for how we think about refugee camps, detention facilities, and humanitarian responses today. Adequate food, shelter, and medical care, provided with dignity, make enormous differences in people's lives and perceptions. Third, the importance of individual actions within systems. Many of the positive experiences these women described came from individual kindnesses by American soldiers and administrators who went beyond official requirements to show compassion. These small acts, multiplied across thousands of interactions, created an overall experience that many found surprisingly positive. This reminds us that even within imperfect systems, individuals can make choices that affirm human dignity and create positive change. Every person working in challenging circumstances with vulnerable populations has opportunities to make such choices every day. Fourth, the necessity of questioning propaganda and simplistic narratives. These Japanese women had been taught that Americans were monsters who would torture and kill them. Americans had been taught that all Japanese were fanatical enemies. Both narratives were oversimplifications that obscured more complex realities. Today, in an age of information warfare and political polarization, the need to question simplistic narratives and seek complex truths is more important than ever. Fifth, the recognition that people's baseline experiences matter enormously in shaping their perceptions. These women's positive assessment of captivity reflected their previous lives of hardship and powerlessness. Understanding this context doesn't diminish the significance of humane treatment, but it reminds us that we must consider people's full life experiences, not just their immediate circumstances. Finally, these stories remind us that history is complex and contains unexpected truths. The women who called American prison camps paradise aren't arguing that imprisonment is good or that war is acceptable. They're testifying to specific experiences that defied expectations and challenged assumptions. Their voices deserve to be heard not to support any particular political position, but because they represent authentic human experiences that complicate and enrich our understanding of history. The story of female Japanese POWs in American custody during World War II is not a simple tale of virtue and righteousness. It's a complex historical episode that reveals much about human nature, military culture, social conditions, and the choices available even in the midst of total war. These women experienced imprisonment during humanity's darkest hours. Yet many found in that imprisonment something they had rarely known in freedom: adequate food, medical care, physical safety, and basic human dignity. Their testimony challenges us to think more deeply about war, peace, justice, and humanity. It reminds us that even in conflict, choices matter. That maintaining one's principles in the face of enemy brutality is not weakness but strength. That small kindnesses can have profound impacts. And that the truth of human experience is always more complex than our simplified narratives suggest. The women who survived American captivity and spoke of it as paradise were not praising imprisonment, They were testifying to the power of basic human decency in extraordinary circumstances, and to the reality that their previous lives had been so difficult that even captivity with adequate food and humane treatment seemed miraculous by comparison. Their voices echo across the decades, reminding us that in every conflict, there are countless individual stories that complicate the grand narratives. That seeing enemies as human beings is not naive but essential. And that the choice to maintain dignity and compassion, even toward those we fight against, ultimately defines who we are. Thank you for listening to this complex chapter of World War II history. May we learn from these stories and carry their lessons forward into our own troubled times.